In the dusty streets of 1864 Nevada Territory, 3 ruthless killers corner what appears to be just another broken-down old drifter, unaware that beneath his trembling hands and clouded eyes lies the most feared gunslinger the West has ever known. When an innocent child steps into the line of fire, will the legend of Ezra the Ghost rise from the grave one last time? The wooden chair creaked like old bones as Ezra Malone shifted his weight on the general store porch. Dust swirled around his worn boots in the autumn heat of 1864, here in Copper Ridge, Nevada Territory. His hands shook as he lifted the dented tin cup to his cracked lips, the bitter coffee doing little to wash away the taste of another sleepless night. Children ran past him without a glance, their laughter echoing off the wooden buildings that lined the main street. To them, he was invisible, just another piece of broken furniture left out in the sun too long. His faded coat hung loose on his thin frame, and his gray beard needed trimming. The mirror in Widow Henderson's store showed him a stranger these days, all hollow cheeks and clouded blue eyes. But those same shaking fingers had once been steady as stone. The same weak voice that now whispered, "Thank you for table scraps," had once made grown men beg for mercy. Deep in his coat pocket, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a Colt Navy revolver that hadn't seen daylight in 10 years. A group of townspeople hurried past, their whispered conversations stopping when they noticed him. He caught fragments of their words. "Worthless old fool. And why doesn't someone run him out of town?" Their faces showed the same look he'd grown used to, disgust mixed with pity, like looking at a sick animal. Ezra pulled his hat down lower and stared at the dusty street. Memories flickered behind his tired eyes, saloons filled with cigar smoke, the weight of a badge on his chest, the sound his spurs made on wooden floors when rooms went quiet at his entrance. Those days felt like someone else's life now. The sun climbed higher, baking the desert town in waves of heat that made the air shimmer like water. Horses tied to hitching posts stamped their feet and swished their tails at flies. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady beats, mixing with the creak of wagon wheels and the chatter of people going about their daily business. Ezra closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to matter, to have people speak his name with respect instead of contempt. The memories came in pieces, a fast draw that made other gunmen step aside, a reputation that traveled faster than telegraph wires, a time when Ezra the Ghost meant something more than just another broken-down drifter. A shadow fell across his face, blocking out the harsh sunlight. When he opened his eyes, 3 men on horseback had stopped in front of the store. Their leader sat tall in his saddle, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His companions flanked him like wolves, their hands resting easy on their gun belts. "Well now," the leader said, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never losing a fight. "What have we got here?" The 3 riders dismounted with the casual grace of men who owned whatever ground their boots touched. Their leader was younger than Ezra by 20 years, with dark hair and eyes that held no warmth. His black vest was clean and well-fitted, and his guns hung low on his hips in the style of a professional killer. "Name's Caleb Thorpe," he announced, though Ezra hadn't asked. "Maybe you heard of me." Ezra had indeed heard the name whispered in saloons and general stores across the territory. Thorpe was a gun for hire who collected debts for rich men who didn't want to dirty their own hands. He'd killed 12 men in fair fights, and twice as many who never saw it coming. Families had been left homeless, and good men had ended up in unmarked graves when Thorpe came calling. The shorter man with the weasel face spat tobacco juice into the dust near Ezra's boots. "Boss asked you a question, old-timer. It's rude not to answer when your betters are talking to you." Ezra's grip tightened on his coffee cup, but he kept his voice steady, just trying to enjoy the morning in peace. "Peace?" Thorpe laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That's rich, coming from someone who looks like he crawled out of a grave. You're bad for business, old man. Makes the paying customers nervous to see trash like you cluttering up the street." The third man, built like a mountain with fists the size of ham hocks, cracked his knuckles with sounds like snapping twigs. "Want me to encourage him to move along, boss?" Across the street, a small boy with sandy hair pressed his face against the window of the barber shop, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Something about the child made Ezra's chest tighten. Maybe it was the way he stood so straight despite his fear, or the way his small hands clenched into fists as if he wanted to help but didn't know how. Thorpe followed Ezra's gaze and smiled wider. "Cute kid. Be a real shame if something happened to him, because his elders didn't teach him proper manners about minding his own business." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Ezra felt something stir deep in his chest, not fear, but something he'd almost forgotten existed. It was the same feeling that had made him pin on a badge 30 years ago. The same fire that had driven him to stand between good people and the wolves that preyed on them. "Leave the boy out of this," Ezra said quietly. "Your quarrel is with me." "Quarrel?" The weasel-faced man kicked dirt toward Ezra's chair. "Old man, you don't have enough fight left in you to quarrel with a church mouse. Look at you shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. Probably haven't had a decent meal in weeks." Thorpe walked closer, his boots making sharp sounds on the wooden boards. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get your sorry hide off this porch and out of my sight. If I see you on this street again, my boys and I are going to have some fun with you. The kind of fun that ends with shallow graves and no questions asked." The tin cup rattled against Ezra's knee as his hands shook worse than usual. But something else was happening too. His right hand, the one without the tremor, was slowly moving toward his coat pocket where the Colt Navy waited in its oiled wrapping. Rico's boot connected with the tin cup like a thunderclap, sending it spinning through the air before it crashed against the wooden post with a bone-jarring clang. The dark coffee splashed across Ezra's only decent coat, staining the faded blue fabric with ugly brown streaks that spread like spilled blood. The old man stared down at his ruined clothes, watching the liquid drip from his sleeves onto the dusty planks below. His shoulders sagged even further, as if the weight of this final humiliation might crush what little spirit remained in his weathered frame. The townspeople gathered at their windows and doorways, some shaking their heads in disgust, others turning away as if they couldn't bear to watch. But something flickered behind Ezra's cloudy eyes, a spark that had nothing to do with the dying sunlight. His right hand, the steady one, moved with deliberate slowness toward his coat pocket, where cold steel waited in patient silence. "Look at that," Thorpe laughed, slapping his knee like he'd just heard the funniest joke in Nevada territory. "Old-timer thinks he's gonna make a play. What you got in there, Grandpa? A rusty old pistol that probably hasn't been fired since the Mexican War?" Sledge cracked his massive knuckles, each pop sounding like dry kindling snapping in a campfire. "Maybe we should check, boss. Can't be too careful with these old coots. Sometimes they get desperate ideas." Across the dusty street, pressed against the general store window, a small boy with sandy hair watched the scene unfold with wide, frightened eyes. Danny McKenna couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but there was something in his expression that caught Ezra's attention, a desperate hope, as if he were silently begging the old man to stand up and fight back. The boy reminded Ezra of someone, though the memory danced just out of reach like smoke from a dying campfire. Another child, in another town, many years ago, when 1864 was still a distant dream, and Ezra Malone was known by a different name, a name that made grown men cross themselves and check their weapons twice before going to sleep. "You got 10 seconds to show us what's in that pocket," Rico snarled, his own hand dropping to rest on his gun handle. "And it better not be anything that'll make us nervous." Ezra's fingers trembled as they touched the smooth ivory grip hidden beneath the stained fabric. The weapon felt familiar in his palm, like greeting an old friend after years of separation. For just a moment, the arthritis pain in his joints seemed to fade, replaced by muscle memory that reached back 3 decades. The wind picked up, swirling dust devils around their boots and making the wooden signs creak on their chains above the boardwalk. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the desert, like a prayer or a warning. "Time's up, old man," Thorpe said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Let's see what you're hiding." "Thorpe! You yellow-bellied snake!" The shout cut through the afternoon heat like a cavalry saber, sharp and bright and unexpected. Everyone turned to see a man striding down the main street, with the confident gait of someone who wore authority like a well-fitted coat. Sheriff Owen McKenna was maybe 55 years old, with steel-gray hair and a mustache that looked like it had been trimmed with military precision. His badge caught the sunlight as he walked, and his right hand rested easy on the butt of his Colt 45. But it was his eyes that made even Thorpe take a step backward, pale gray eyes that had seen too much death and weren't afraid to see a little more if the situation called for it. "Well, well," Thorpe drawled, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "If it ain't Sheriff McKenna, come to spoil our fun?" "Fun?" McKenna stopped about 20 paces away, far enough back to have room to draw if things went bad. "That what you call picking on old folks these days? Must be getting soft in your old age, Caleb." Rico and Sledge shifted nervously, their hands hovering near their weapons but not quite touching them. Even hired killers knew better than to draw on a lawman without serious provocation, especially one with McKenna's reputation for straight shooting and hard justice. Ezra remained perfectly still on his porch step, his hand still buried in his coat pocket, feeling like a spectator at his own hanging. The coffee stains on his clothes were already starting to attract flies in the desert heat, and he could smell the sour odor rising from the wet fabric. "Funny thing about timing," McKenna continued, his voice carrying that particular tone lawmen used when they had an ace hidden up their sleeve. "Just got a telegram from Carson City about an hour ago. Seems there's a reward posted for 3 men who robbed and murdered the Patterson family last month. Left a woman and her 2 little girls dead in their own kitchen." The color drained from Rico's face like water from a broken barrel. Sledge took another step toward the horses, his massive frame suddenly looking less intimidating and more like a cornered animal searching for an escape route. But Thorpe just smiled, though it didn't reach his cold eyes. "That's a serious accusation, Sheriff. Hope you got some proof to back up that kind of talk." "Witnesses say the killers were 3 men riding together," McKenna replied. "One of them had a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. Funny coincidence, don't you think?" Thorpe's hand moved unconsciously to touch the jagged white line that marked his face, a souvenir from a knife fight in Sacramento 2 years earlier. His smile faltered for just a moment before returning, but Ezra caught the brief flash of worry that crossed his features. From across the street came a sound that made every adult present freeze with terror. The creak of a door opening, followed by light footsteps on wooden planks. Danny McKenna, the sheriff's 10-year-old son, had pushed his way out of the general store and was walking directly toward the confrontation with the fearless determination that only children possessed. "Danny, no!" a woman's voice called from inside the store. But the boy kept coming, his small chin set with stubborn courage that looked exactly like his father's. "Pa!" the child called out, his high voice carrying clearly across the dusty street. "You don't have to face them alone." The distraction lasted only a heartbeat. But in the deadly mathematics of gunfighting, a heartbeat could mean the difference between living and dying. Thorpe's hand swept down toward his holster with practiced speed, but he wasn't aiming at Sheriff McKenna. He was drawing on the boy. The boy's scream cut through the desert air like a knife through butter. Danny McKenna had just stepped into the street when Thorpe's gun swung toward him like a snake striking its prey. Time seemed to crawl as slow as winter honey. Ezra watched the killer's fingers squeeze the trigger, while Sheriff McKenna shouted from 20 feet away too far to help his son. The old man's body moved before his mind could catch up. 30 years of buried instincts exploding to life like a dam bursting. His right hand swept down to his coat pocket with the speed of a diving hawk. The ivory-handled Colt appeared in his palm as if it had always belonged there, no longer the weapon of a shaking old fool, but an extension of pure deadly will. 3 shots rang out faster than a person could count them, The first bullet shattered Thorpe's gun hand, sending his weapon spinning through the air like a broken toy. Blood sprayed across the wooden sidewalk as the killer screamed and clutched his mangled fingers. Rico's gun belt exploded in a shower of leather and metal from the second shot, leaving him standing there with his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. The third bullet found Sledge's whiskey bottle, turning it into a fountain of amber liquid that soaked his pants. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Sheriff McKenna, his own half-drawn gun forgotten in his hand. "I ain't never seen shooting like that in all my born days." Ezra stood up from the porch step, his legs steady as mountain stone for the first time in years. The tremor that had plagued his left hand was gone, vanished like smoke on the wind. His clouded eyes now blazed with the fire that had once made grown men cross the street to avoid him. The watching townspeople pressed against windows and doorways, their faces painted with shock and wonder. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, sensing they were seeing something that would become legend. Danny McKenna stood frozen in the middle of the street, his young eyes wide as silver dollars. The boy's mother rushed from the general store, her face white with terror as she gathered her son into her arms. Thorpe swayed on his feet, his ruined hand pressed against his chest, while blood seeped between his fingers. His face had turned the color of old flour, and sweat beaded on his forehead like morning dew. "That's impossible," Rico stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Ezra Malone died 20 years ago in Deadwood. Everybody knows that story." Ezra smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold promise of winter storms. "Son, you shouldn't believe everything you hear in saloons. The ghost has been sleeping, not dead. And you just woke him up." The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the dusty street, making Ezra's figure loom larger than life. His coat fluttered in the desert breeze, and the Colt Navy in his hand caught the golden light like polished silver. Rico and Sledge began backing toward their horses, their faces showing the kind of fear that comes when a man realizes he's made a terrible mistake. Thorpe tried to follow, but stumbled, his legs weak from blood loss and shock. "Now then," Ezra said, his voice carrying across the street like thunder before a storm. "We need to have ourselves a little talk about manners." The silence stretched tight as a bowstring, ready to snap. Every person on that dusty street held their breath, waiting to see what the legendary ghost would do next. Sheriff McKenna slowly holstered his weapon and moved to stand beside his son, one protective hand on Danny's shoulder. His weathered face showed the kind of respect that one fighting man gives to another who has proven himself worthy. "You boys have two choices," Ezra announced, never taking his eyes off the three would-be killers. "You can ride out of Copper Ridge right now and never come back, or you can try your luck again. But I should warn you, I'm feeling much better than I was 10 minutes ago." Thorpe's face twisted with pain and rage. Blood continued to drip from his shattered hand, forming small red circles in the dust at his feet. "This ain't over, old man. Nobody makes Caleb Thorpe look like a fool, and lives to tell the tale." "Funny thing about that," Ezra replied, spinning his Colt once around his finger before sliding it back into his coat pocket. The movement was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "I've been dying by inches for the past 10 years. You threatening to kill me is about as scary as a paper bag full of wind." Martha McKenna approached slowly, her arms still wrapped protectively around her son. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Malone. Danny is all we have left since the fever took our other children." Those words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He understood now why the sheriff had moved with such desperate speed, why the boy's mother looked at her son like he was made of spun glass. They had already lost too much to lose anything more. "Ma'am," he said softly, his hard expression gentling, "sometimes we don't choose to be heroes. Sometimes being a hero chooses us." Widow Henderson stepped out of her general store, her gray hair catching the afternoon light. "Ezra Malone," she called out, her voice strong despite her age. "You saved that boy's life. Far as I'm concerned, you've got a job at my store for as long as you want it." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Ezra looked around at the faces watching him, no longer filled with pity and disgust, but with something he hadn't seen directed at him in years. Respect. Rico helped Thorpe toward their horses while Sledge mounted up with shaking hands. The big man kept looking over his shoulder at Ezra, as if expecting the ghost to shoot him in the back. "Remember what I told you, boys," Ezra called out as they prepared to leave. "If I hear of you bothering innocent folks again, especially children, I'll come looking for you. And next time, I might not be feeling so generous." The three riders spurred their horses and galloped out of town, leaving behind only dust clouds and the memory of how quickly everything can change. As they disappeared into the desert, the people of Copper Ridge began to emerge fully from their hiding places. Danny McKenna broke free from his mother's arms and walked up to Ezra with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. "Are you really him? Are you really the famous ghost?" Ezra knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. "I was, once upon a time. But ghosts are supposed to stay buried, son. Maybe it's time for Ezra Malone to try living again, instead of just surviving." The sun was beginning to set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. And for the first time in 20 years, Ezra Malone felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The dying sun painted the wooden buildings of Copper Ridge in shades of orange and gold as townspeople slowly emerged from their hiding places. Sheriff McKenna holstered his gun and walked toward Ezra, his boots crunching on the sandy ground. The three bullies had ridden away like scared rabbits, leaving behind only dust clouds and the memory of how quickly a legend could come back to life. "Mr. Malone," the sheriff said, extending his weathered hand, "I reckon I owe you more than I can ever pay back. That boy means the whole world to me." Ezra shook the offered hand, surprised by how warm and strong it felt. For years, people had avoided touching him, as if his bad luck might rub off on them. "No debt needed, Sheriff. I'm just glad my old hands remembered what to do when it mattered." Young Danny broke free from his mother's arms and ran to his father, his face glowing with excitement. "Pa! Did you see how fast he moved? It was like watching lightning strike 3 times in a row." McKenna scooped up his son, holding him close. "I saw it, boy. But don't you ever put yourself in danger like that again. What you did was foolish, even if it was brave." Danny grinned and looked over his father's shoulder at Ezra. "Are you really the famous ghost everyone talks about in stories?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Ezra felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. All those years of running, hiding, pretending to be someone else. He thought about the young man he used to be, quick with a gun and proud of his reputation. Then he looked at this family, at the love between father and son, and something shifted inside his chest. "I was that man once," Ezra said slowly. "But ghosts belong in the ground, son. Maybe it's time for plain old Ezra to try living again, instead of just surviving." Martha McKenna approached them, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. She was a strong woman, the kind who could birth babies and fight off wolves, but her hands shook as she spoke. "Mr. Malone, I don't know the right words to thank you. Danny is all we have left since the fever took our other children 2 summers ago." Those words hit Ezra like a punch to the stomach. He understood now why the sheriff had looked so desperate when his boy walked into danger. Losing children was a pain that never truly healed, just learned to live with like an old wound that ached before storms. "Ma'am," Ezra replied, his voice softer than mountain snow. "Sometimes we don't choose to be heroes. Sometimes being a hero chooses us. And all we can do is try not to let folks down." As darkness began to creep across the desert, something wonderful happened. The townspeople who had ignored Ezra for months started approaching him. Old Pete from the blacksmith shop clapped him on the shoulder. Mrs. Henderson from the general store pressed a fresh cup of coffee into his hands. Children who had once run from his trembling figure now gathered around to hear about the famous gunfighter. For the first time, in longer than he could remember, Ezra Malone felt like he belonged somewhere. 3 weeks had passed since the showdown, and the morning sun found Ezra sitting on the same porch steps where everything had changed. But now, instead of shaking hands and bitter coffee, he held a steady cup filled with the best brew in Nevada territory. His left hand no longer trembled, not because some miracle had healed him, but because he had finally remembered who he really was underneath all those years of hiding. Sheriff McKenna walked over from the jailhouse, a yellow telegram fluttering in his hand and a satisfied smile on his sun-weathered face. "Thought you might want to hear this news?" he said, settling down beside Ezra like they were old friends. "Got word from the boys up in Elko. Those 3 troublemakers tried robbing the First National Bank yesterday. How did that work out for them?" Ezra asked, though he wasn't particularly worried about the answer. "Rico and that big fellow Sledge won't be bothering anyone ever again," McKenna reported. "Thorpe's still breathing, but barely. Seems like that busted trigger finger you gave him made him slower than molasses in January. Bank guard put 2 bullets in him before he could even clear leather." They sat quietly, watching the daily life of their small town unfold before them. Wagons rolled past, carrying supplies and hope. Children played games in the dusty street, while their mothers hung laundry and gossiped about whose chickens were laying the best eggs. It was the music of a place where people felt safe enough to live normal lives. Young Danny appeared around the corner, his school books tucked under one arm and a serious look on his freckled face. He had been thinking hard about something for days, and now he approached Ezra with the careful dignity that children use when they have important questions to ask. "Mr. Malone, I've been wondering about what you said before, about how ghosts should stay buried and all." "Have you now?" Ezra smiled, setting down his coffee cup. "What did you figure out?" "Well," Danny said, choosing his words like a prospector picking through rocks for gold, "I think maybe some ghosts aren't meant to stay underground forever. Maybe some of them need to come back when good people are in trouble." Ezra studied the boy's earnest face, seeing something there that reminded him of his own youth, back when the world seemed divided into clear good and evil with nothing in between. "You might be onto something there, son. The trick is knowing when to be a ghost and when to be just a regular person. How do you tell the difference?" The old gunslinger looked out at the busy street, watching Sheriff McKenna reading his newspaper on the jail steps, seeing Widow Henderson sweeping dust from her store, observing all the ordinary people living their ordinary lives in this small island of civilization surrounded by endless desert. "I reckon," he said finally, "a ghost shows up when folks need saving from something they can't handle alone, but a man sticks around afterward to help them learn how to save themselves." Danny nodded, as if this wisdom made perfect sense to his 10-year-old mind. Then his serious expression melted into a huge grin. "So you're really going to stay here, forever and always?" Ezra felt something warm and light spreading through his chest, like sunrise after the longest night of his life. For decades, he had been running from town to town, always looking over his shoulder, never allowing himself to care about anyone or let anyone care about him. The future had always looked like a heavy burden to carry, but now it seemed like a present, waiting to be unwrapped one day at a time. "Yeah, son," he said, raising his tin cup in a small salute to the bright morning sky. "I think old Ezra Malone is finally ready to stop running from his own shadow and start chasing some new dreams instead."